The first time they saw Nora Halvorsen nailing rough-sawn pine boards tight against the sides of her cabin, covering even the window frames and swallowing the old walls as if she were wrapping the house in a second skin, the men down in the valley immediately whispered that the widow had finally lost her mind. Caleb Rourke, the quickest mouth in the area, squinted at the overhang Nora had extended, draping it over the cabin roof like a hen, lowering herself to shield her eggs, and drawled with heavy sarcasm. That's what happens when a woman lives alone too long, boarding up her house like she's sealing a coffin. They passed around the whiskey bottle, leaned on their shovels and picks, chuckled as if there was nothing worth watching, but their eyes kept drilling toward the steep road where Nora was hauling a mule cart loaded with boards downhill, her thin but winter-hard shoulders unyielding. Her two boys, now the only ones left, the older around 12, the younger about 10, trailed behind, each dragging a bundle of long branches taller than themselves, with the timid yet stubborn gait of children who knew winter never showed mercy. Leaves had barely begun to turn gold when the wind already carried a heavy dampness, that strange breath the Shoshone called winter's footprint. The previous summer had been cracked dry and erratic. The river shrank to silver streaks, livestock thinned to bone. Word from Fort Washakie said the weather east was turning upside down, and if the wind shifted, it would soon sweep this way. But no one, not even Nora herself, who had lost her husband to an unusual wet cold, understood that the crude boards she was nailing that day would mark the boundary between life and death for the entire valley in the coming winter. Nora Halvorsen had not learned how to build a shed from this Wyoming soil. The roots of that idea came from the Norwegian coast where she was born, where the north wind cut flesh and salt frost soaked into every fiber of wood, where people passed down the old saying, "Fire is only warm when the wood is dry as stone." As a child, Nora had followed her father to the woodyard, listening to him teach about ved-torking, the Scandinavian technique of drying and storing firewood. There, people tapped two logs together to hear the hollow ring that told them moisture had left the core. They stacked wood north-south, so the cold air could sweep through and carry dampness away, and they always raised it off the ground, because one night of salt frost could turn an entire winter into disaster. That knowledge the Norwegians treated as survival instinct, while the American West did not. When Nora followed her husband to Wyoming, she carried that entire treasury of experience inside her, but she never thought she would need to use it all until the winter 2 years earlier, the winter that took Samuel. He did not die because bitter cold swallowed his body. He died from something quieter. Wet wood. That day, the wind blew backward down the valley, moisture seeped into the woodpile, and when Samuel tried to start the fire, the logs only hissed out thick, moldy smoke. The stove died down, the cabin turned stone cold. Samuel ran outside to split drier wood, but in the wet snow, cold flooded his lungs like a blade. He collapsed less than 10 steps from the door. Nora found him when his hands had already stiffened. From that night on, the obsession with moisture became an inseparable memory. She understood that in Wyoming people feared snow, wind, blizzards. But what killed Samuel was not those things, it was the dampness inside the very firewood they relied on. So when Nora began nailing the first boards onto the cabin, her purpose was not to raise some bizarre wall, but to create a multi-layer moisture barrier, a rough version of Scandinavian technique, where dry air was trapped between two walls, like a natural damp-proof coat. The people of Arrow Creek Basin saw a strange structure, but to Nora it was the only way to keep the fire alive. Every log she hauled down from the slope was tested for moisture by its ring, placed north-south as her father had taught, raised on supports, so the ground could not steal the precious dryness. Every bundle of branches, every plank, was a vow she repeated to herself. If the wood isn't dry, both fire and people die. That saying of Samuel's, the man who once thought raw strength was enough to conquer winter, now drove Nora to build the shed, nail every board, seal every draft. Not because she wanted to defy the whole valley, but because she knew what others did not. Cold kills fast, but dampness kills first. And a widow no longer had the right to be wrong again. So when the shed began to take shape, Nora moved to the part no one in Arrow Creek Basin expected, erecting a wind wall of firewood along the north face, where the damp winds from the Bighorn range always swept down hardest. She chose each type of wood according to the properties her father had taught back in Norway. cottonwood light and open to let wind pass without holding moisture. Lodgepole pine straight and sturdy for tight rows. Aspen softer but quick to absorb dampness, forming a natural buffer on the outer edge. That wall was not the haphazard stockpile Wyoming folk were used to. Nora stacked the pieces in varying thicknesses, creating an outer face that met the wind, slowed its force, and forced moisture to drip out before it could reach the inner wall. Between the shed and the cabin, she deliberately left a narrow gap, just wide enough for dry air to circulate. That was the technique Scandinavians called the breathing layer, where slow circulation kept the inner wall from ever collecting dew. The wood was oriented north-south, exactly as she had learned back home, where sea storms could soak a log in hours. When the first seasonal winds tore through Arrow Creek, the neighbors thought Nora's firewood wall would collapse or swell with water. But it stood firm, giving off the sound of wind broken into many gentle streams. The men who had mocked her now began stopping mid-sentence when passing that slope. They saw how the lodgepole poles interlocked like a frame system, how the front cottonwood caught the wind, how the rear aspen held the moisture, but no one understood why a widow could calculate to this degree. They were used to round piles, sun-dried for a few days, then stacked against the cabin wall. No one thought about airflow or breathing space. No one believed wind could be directed with firewood. But Nora knew every detail. Every gap for wind escape, every pole to prevent pooling, every layered tilt to drain dampness to the ground. It was not recklessness, but a form of frontier engineering the locals had never imagined. And when they looked at that firewood wall chest-high on a man, nearly the full length of one cabin side, solid as if pegged with steel, a few people in the valley fell silent for the first time. No one said it aloud, but something had shifted in their eyes. The confusion of men who could see a certain intelligence at work, only they did not know its name. Then, just as Nora's firewood wall was completed, the historic cold rain arrived as if to test the entire valley. For 2 straight days, from Montana down to Colorado, the Rocky Mountains drowned in a phenomenon the military stations of the time recorded under the chilling name black ice rain, rain that fell almost frozen, coating every surface in a slick black glass. In Arrow Creek Basin, that rain hammered roofs, flung stinging cold droplets that numbed skin on contact, then soaked straight into the woodpiles the pioneers thought would carry them through winter. In just hours, the cold water pierced the bark, saturated every fiber, reached the very heart, creating what Western settlers called dead firewood, the kind that would not burn even if the stove were packed full. When the rain eased, the people of Arrow Creek tried lighting fires to warm livestock and dry bedding, but they quickly discovered the horror. The wood did not catch, but wept water. Lodgepole logs they had trusted as dry now oozed at the cuts. Placed on glowing coals, they did not burn but released thick white steam reeking of mold, cold vapor that snuffed the stove in minutes. Children in many cabins began shivering in the middle of the afternoon, while men sat helpless before piles wet from the heart out. In some homes they tried splitting logs for drier cores, but each axe blow sprayed water as if they were chopping ice instead of wood. Night fell. Wind from the Bighorn Basin poured through the valley, carrying cold that sliced faces. For many families, this was the first night they understood wet, cold winter, the kind where the stove loses before it even starts. But up on the lone slope, where Nora's cabin stood, there was no sound of axes, no sighs, only an odd, certain silence. Her shed-enclosed cabin with its breathing walls, its cottonwood and lodgepole wind wall remained untouched by seepage. Rain slid off the overhang, split into separate streams, and followed the ditches Nora had dug at the start of the season. The outer aspen absorbed whatever dampness lingered, keeping the inner layers dry, and while the whole valley struggled with dead wood, the fire in Nora's cabin burned steady, its golden glow showing through the small gaps she had left on purpose, as if the entire structure were calmly looking down on the valley, defying the black rain that had just crushed every preparation others had thought sufficient. As soon as the black rain stopped, the people of Arrow Creek rushed to save their woodpiles, and at that very moment the knowledge gap between an immigrant widow and the native pioneers became clearer than ever. Believing the problem was simply lack of cover, they threw up hasty lean-tos with a few posts, tarps, even dragged cowhides over roofs to block moisture, but no one realized those airtight covers trapped dampness inside. turning already dead piles into cold, sodden sponges. Nor did anyone know about dew points, the boundary where vapor turns to liquid, happening right between tarp and wood surface. So each morning they stepped out to find the wood wetter than the day before. The men of the region were used to trusting muscle and endurance over knowledge. They believed covering the rain and catching a little sun would be enough to revive the wood. So in the post-rain chill, many dragged piles into the weak autumn sunlight, hoping that thin warmth could draw water from the cores. But any Scandinavian knew this was hopeless. Late fall sun could not penetrate the heart of the log, and when night fell with dampness heavy as a wet blanket, every trace of daytime dryness was sucked back in minutes. The next morning their wood was wetter still, surfaces blackened, bark edges beaded with water, and when split, cold liquid sprayed out as if they were chopping frozen mud rather than wood. Some more determined pioneers stacked wood tight against cabin walls to borrow, warmth leaking from inside. Unaware that log cabin walls breathed strongly, drawing moisture in at night and releasing it at dawn, accidentally turning their woodpile spot into the thickest condensation zone. Just days after the black rain, the entire valley was filled with paralyzed woodpiles. Taps sounded solid as rock. Lifted to the stove, they spewed white steam. Placed near hot coals, they died as if strangled. Meanwhile, Nora's cabin wrapped in double shed, cottonwood wind wall, breathing gap between walls stood bone dry. The inner lodgepole remained light, tapping out the crisp crack of winter bone. When a few men, curious and somewhat embarrassed, climbed the slope to peer at Nora's setup, they no longer laughed out loud. For the first time, they saw not the delusion of an abandoned widow, but knowledge they had never thought they needed to learn, knowledge from a place farther, colder, harsher than Wyoming. And when they witnessed the fire in Nora's cabin still burning red while their own stoves only exhaled vapor, something quietly changed in their eyes. The familiar frontier pride gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. That the woman they had mocked might be the only person in the area who truly understood what this winter was. But those failures of the Arrow Creek people were only the beginning of something larger, because that summer had carried signs only the truly attentive could clearly see. Arrow Creek Basin entered a strange weather pattern never recorded in the memory of either settlers or natives. Days scorching hot as if fire were poured from the sky, cracking the ground into white gashes. But at night, dampness rose from the shrunken creek like sea fog, clinging to skin, soaking hair, beating on window edges. Some called it a hot, drought, cold, damp spell, while one hunter who had been as far as Idaho said such heat-moisture crossover was a sign winter would arrive as strangling cold, the kind even the strongest stove struggled against. Crow passing through Arrow Creek brought warnings heavy as stone. This winter will find every breath and take it. To the settlers, that sounded like odd superstition, but many Crow explained they read the eagle's flight paths, the early migration rhythm of mule deer, the unusually low numbers of ground squirrels, all signs their ancestors had read for centuries. And just as they warned, a series of natural shifts in the valley began turning ominous. Eagles left high nests nearly a month early. Deer herds moved down into the basin midsummer, as if fleeing something on the peaks. The dry ground carried a deep, damp smell, like the eve of heavy frost. Veteran hunters started exchanging glances when they noticed last winter's leftover snow, hardened darker and held cold, longer signs of a mismatch between air temperature and ground moisture, what modern science would call chaos in low-level jet streams. But back then, frontier folk had no words for it. They only knew such weather often took people in the night. Nora did not merely notice those natural signs, she felt them through memories of growing up on Norway's cold sea, where winter also arrived with strange dampness before real snow fell. When she saw thick dew on wood every morning despite blistering daytime sun, Nora understood the current shed was only half the solution. Moisture was rising from below, from the soil, from sudden cold nights draping the valley in a wet blanket. That was the hardest dampness to escape, the kind only a layered barrier system could defeat. So while the people of Arrow Creek were still struggling to dry their wood, Nora began raising a second shed ring, set an arm's width out from the first. People in the valley watched from afar and told each other the widow had gone too far now. But the sharper-eyed began to realize for the first time. She was not nailing boards randomly, but measuring every gap, every slant, as if building a slow air machine, a structure Wyoming had never seen. She hauled timber down from the forest, steps steady, each aspen and cottonwood log placed precisely like gears in a large machine only she could see the blueprint for. Mark and Evan, the boys many pitied as orphaned and forced to grow up too soon, were learning in the process things no one else in the valley could teach. Nora taught them how to listen to the wood. A hollow ring meant the core was dry. A heavy, solid thud like stones striking meant hidden saturation. A light crack at the bark edge meant the wood was shrinking properly under the north wind. It was not just a lesson for winter preparation, it was the legacy of a frontier family, where knowledge was not written in books but passed ear to hand to survival. While the village still believed a few roof fixes would see them through the storm, Nora was already months ahead. She was building not just protection but a system. Outer layer to meet wind, middle to absorb damp, inner to preserve dry. A structure that in Norway they called the house with 3 breaths. But in Wyoming, it left people staring wide-eyed, unable to understand why a widow could build something even a crew of carpenters had never imagined. And as the second shed ring gradually took shape on the hillside, the signs from nature, from the crow words, from the strange damp in the wind, all pieced together into a truth only Nora faced squarely. This winter would be unlike any Arrow Creek had ever known. As soon as the second shed ring closed, Nora immediately moved to the refinement stage, the work that, if anyone had stood still long enough to watch, would have shown this widow was not merely building a cover but erecting a survival machine run on air, moisture, and time. She began by cutting V-shaped wind grids at both ends of the shed. Narrow slits tapering into arrow points aimed straight along the north-south wind flow, forcing cold air in through small openings but out through wider ones. That very difference created natural circulation, what engineers later called the Venturi effect. But at the time, Nora only knew her father had said, "If the wind leaves wider than it enters, it will carry the dampness with it." Between the 2 shed layers, she inserted rows of thin lodgepole stakes, forming 3-tiered walls, outer to block strong gusts, middle to draw moisture, inner to stay dry. Each tier was offset so no damp stream could travel straight to the cabin. She dug drainage trenches along the shed foot to standard frontier slope just inches above ground, but enough for water to slide away without pooling. That was something the villagers saw but did not understand. Why such a tiny ditch mattered so much. Meanwhile, Mark and Evan were tasked with checking kindling the fire-starting wood. Under Nora's guidance, it was no longer random bundles. It was sorted like inventory in a small factory. Thin bark fibers for quick catch, small aspen sticks to sustain the first flame, aged pine shavings for lasting heat. Each type went into separate compartments marked with small knife notches. Other children tossed wood into piles. Nora's sons placed wood the way a machinist fits parts into a steam engine. Across the valley, every winter cabin relied on one dry wood pile and an iron stove. But Nora's cabin, wrapped in double sheds, naturally vented, raised wood floor, grated kindling, breathing walls, draining roof had become the most sophisticated heating structure in Arrow Creek that no frontier settler had ever considered. Passers-by saw only rough boards and stacked wood, but anyone who truly looked saw a system of passive heat and moisture control, a forerunner of modern architecture created with axe, wooden pegs, and the memory of a woman who had lived beside Scandinavia's cold sea. Sometimes a man would stop and say half mockingly, half curious, "You aiming to turn the cabin into one giant stove?" Nora did not answer. She only adjusted a crooked board, tightened another peg, tapped a pine log, and listened to its ring sharp as metal. When the evening wind blew through the V-grids and carried the low hum of stretched air, the people standing at the foot of the slope fell involuntarily silent. Because in that brief moment, even they, men who always believed the frontier needed only strength and daring, recognized that the widow was not building to withstand winter. She was building to defeat it. Not long after the shed ring was completed, winter struck with a sign the whole region would still talk about years later. The wind shifted abruptly. The Shoshone said the wind changed its breath. When the last warm gusts withdrew from Arrow Creek Valley, a razor-sharp cold front poured down from the north. The very climate phenomenon modern science calls the 1875 La Niña, one of the events that plunged western winters into deeper freezes than usual. The moisture built up through the abnormal summer, combined with the descending cold air, to produce a type of blizzard seen only a few times that century. A wet, cold blizzard, the enemy even the toughest frontier folk dreaded. The snow did not fall in flakes, but in thin, watery sheets that coated the ground and then froze solid under the next wave of cold wind, forming layered ice like onion skins. In just hours, the entire Arrow Creek turned into a flat white basin where trails, yards, and woodpiles became indistinguishable. Cabins vanished in howling gusts, strong enough to shred the breath of anyone standing outside. By late afternoon, people tried lighting stoves again, but what had happened after the black rain now became stark and merciless. The moment a faint glow appeared and flames touched the cold, damp surface of the wood, a piercing hiss rang out the sound every settler feared because it meant the core was boiling, releasing steam, killing the fire. In 2 minutes, the flames died. In 20, the stove went stone cold. Vapor rose and froze into tiny ice crystals on the chimney mouth. In many cabins, children clutched the thickest blankets, but cotton layers could not block the damp cold seeping up from the floor. Livestock in barns exhaled thin plumes, then stood motionless as the wet chill gripped their lungs like an invisible hand. A few men who believed they could beat winter with brute force crammed wood into stoves until flames flared briefly, then collapsed, leaving thick smoke that stung eyes and throats. The harder they tried, the more the moisture in the wood rose against them. Some cabins sank into darkness after an hour. In others, people heard children crying in the wind, men cursing, women trying to rouse husbands slipping into sleep as cold tightened around their bodies. Whiteout winds, gusts, whipping snow at face level blocked every path. Snow grains struck skin like needles, blinding vision. No one knew where the creek trail was or the slope path. In that thick darkness, Nora's cabin was the only point still holding warmth. Outside the shed, the wind slammed the walls but was scattered by the 3-tier wind barriers, leaving only a low oceanic rumble. Inside the shed, Nora's wood remained dry as midsummer tapping a lodgepole still rang out a crisp crack, every kindling twig brittle enough to snap into dust. She started the stove not in haste, but with habits forged in Norwegian winters. A little bark fiber at the bottom, a handful of dry aspen shavings to catch, then aged pine logs crossed to give the fire breathing room. A few gentle puffs and the flames roared golden, spreading the first steady warmth through the cabin. Outside, the wind began its long howl, the sound of a double-layer storm. One sheet of ice whipped aloft, colliding with the next falling layer to drop in dense white streaks like scarves. Even the most seasoned pioneers knew this kind of blizzard could kill in 30 minutes if someone was caught outside. And sure enough, moments later the first knock sounded at Nora's door. It was Mary Kinton, the woman living at the foot of the hill, shivering uncontrollably, lips purple, fingers so stiff she could not unwrap her own shawl. Her eyes stared wide with terror as she mumbled, "The wood won't burn. The wood won't burn anymore." Nora pulled her through the narrow door, slit kept tight on purpose to prevent warmth escaping. Mark hurried for blankets. Evan helped Mrs. Kinton to the stove. Less than 5 minutes later, another knock came weaker, halting. It was the Brown family. 2 children wrapped in thick cloth yet shaking violently, breaths catching. In the lamplight, Nora saw thin ice newly formed on the father's hands from airborne moisture, the ice that killed faster than temperature alone. Outside, the whiteout swirled around the cabin, erasing the valley. In desperation, people began abandoning their own homes for any place with real fire. They struggled through the storm, heads bowed, eyes squeezed shut against driving snow. Some collapsed midway, covered by the thickening blanket, but the glow from Nora's cabin, faint through board cracks, was enough to guide those still able to move. One by one they arrived, knocking with frozen knuckles, voices barely audible. Nora opened the door each time, letting them in while preserving the heat. She said little, only motioned for her sons to lead them close to the stove where warmth radiated steadily, never faltering. Meanwhile, the fire burned strong as if outside were not one of the worst weather nights in regional history. The double shed kept wind out. The breathing gap between walls kept dry. Drainage ditches prevented ice buildup. Every detail Nora had worked on for months now functioned like parts of a sophisticated survival machine. Down in the valley, cabins sank one by one into darkness. Fires died. Thick smoke rose. People huddled under blankets yet could not overcome the damp cold rising from the ground. Death did not come with the storm's roar, but with the quiet extinguishing of flames, the surrender of wet wood. And as the night dragged on, only one place in all of Arrow Creek still held enough warmth to save lives. The cabin on the hillside where a widow once mocked was opening her narrow door, letting each trembling person step in from winter's brutality. Inside the cabin, warmth gathered into a small but stubborn circle around people who had just escaped the edge of death. Mary Kinton sat close to the stove, eyes clouded from deep cold, fingers so stiff it took both of Mark's hands to peel away the wet cloth. She could only draw short breaths, each one rasping her throat. The Brown children were worse. The older one shook hard enough to nosebleed, bright red drops stark on white cotton like a warning the body was losing control. The younger, curled tight, lips blue, chest heaving as if fighting the cold, squeezing its lungs. Nora placed a hand on each forehead, checked breathing, pressed lightly on wrists to feel pulses, actions learned from harsh Norwegian winters when people saved each other from sea storms. Outside, the whiteout still shrieked through the V-shaped vents, but each time it hit the shed, the sound fractured into a deep oceanic rumble, unable to reach inside. The stove's steady golden warmth became the last thread tying them to life. When the final person was brought in that night, a man named Branner, who collapsed at the door from exhaustion, Nora slid the bolt shut, leaving only the smallest gap for air without losing heat. She stood in the center, looked at the huddled circle around the stove, and said in a hoarse but clear voice, "No one dies here tonight." It was not a promise, but a command, something even the valley's strongest men would not have dared utter. As they regained some strength, whispers spread through the cabin, no one starting it yet, all reaching the same conclusion. We lost because of wet wood. No one spoke of the storm, the cold, the wind. They all understood. What nearly killed them was not winter itself, but what they had dismissed moisture that crept into wood cores and killed fire from within. Nora heard but did not reproach. She only nodded slightly, acknowledging a truth she had known for years. Then she began organizing the small space like an outpost in the blizzard. She divided people into 3 groups. No one objected because everyone knew they lived thanks to her knowledge. Mark, Evan, Nora called her sons, show them how to lay out kindling. The boys moved at once like seasoned hands. They opened the kindling chest under the table and brought out the 3 sorted types: thin pine bark fibers, small aspen sticks, aged pine chips. They explained to adults accustomed to large logs from the start. Fire catches on vapor first, not wood. This catches fast. This holds the flame. This makes heat. Frontier men, proud of striking sparks with flint, now nodded quietly and learned from 2 fatherless boys. The second group, stove keepers, Nora instructed herself. She showed how to place logs for breathing room, how to turn pine so moisture escaped upward instead of pooling, how to listen for wood singing when burning right. Nora said, "If you hear hissing, don't force more wood. Wait for flame to reach the dry core." The men looked at her like a teacher they never expected to need. The third group, shed vent clearers, checked the V-vents, cleared snow, ensured airflow stayed open. They went outside into gusts that numbed exposed skin in minutes, yet no one complained, because now they knew. If the shed stopped breathing, the cabin would die too. The scene inside became something never seen in a frontier community. Men, women, children, elders, all working in silent rhythm around the knowledge of a widow they had mocked weeks earlier. No one spoke of who owned the house, or who was outsider. Only warmth mattered, and the person who kept it was the one they followed. At one point, Mary Kinton whispered, voice trembling more from emotion than cold, "We're alive because of her." No one disagreed. No one added anything. Firelight flickered on wind-burned faces, but in their eyes was something winter could not kill: respect, for the first time in their lives, for a woman they had once seen as weak. And outside, as the storm kept hammering the valley as if to crush everything, Nora's cabin with double shed, 3-tier wind walls, drainage trenches, and steady stove stood firm like a small fortress against the harshest winter. That night in a house once cramped for just mother and sons, more than 10 people gathered, sharing warmth, sharing knowledge. For the first time, the Arrow Creek community united around someone they had never seen as leader. She had no weapons, no strength, no loud voice, only knowledge and persistence fierce enough that even winter had to yield. When the blizzard finally eased and the whiteout settled, Arrow Creek did not escape danger, it simply entered a quieter but deeper destruction. Thaw floods. Snow piled for days began melting into streams when an unusual warm front pushed in from the South Valley, seeping into every cabin log crack like a patient animal seeking entry. The freeze-thaw-refreeze cycle repeated endlessly. Water-soaked fibers froze overnight, melted again under weak sun. Each freeze expanded ice, prying wood fibers apart like cracks in dry earth. Each thaw drove water deeper into cores, carrying mold and dampness. Though frontier folk had no name for it, they were witnessing the freeze-thaw cycle, the most destructive force a woodpile could face. Just 2 days after snowmelt, the wood in cabins turned into something that chilled even lifelong mountain dwellers. Once hard lodgepole became mushy like mud, taps sounded muffled, edges rotted into white powder. Kindling bundles left on porches sprouted thin mold webs that fluttered in the breeze. Some desperate cabins tried relighting stoves, but they did not understand that forcing damp wood produced smoke, not heat.